My name is J.L. Bell, and I have this website, Boston 1775, which is really a blog. I've been keeping it for over 11 years on a daily basis, and on it I share what I call history, analysis, and unabashed gossip about what happened in revolutionary New England and other aspects of revolutionary America. So, for instance, the past couple of days I've been exploring this story which was published in 1829, which was at one point attributed to Nathaniel Hawthorne, but it doesn't turn out to be by Nathaniel Hawthorne, and it seems to be based on a particular man from Tewksbury's experiences in the Battle of Bunker Hill, and then he was captured, and then he escaped from a British prison, and it's all very dramatic, but one of the questions was, okay, is this actually a accurate, reliable source? And today I came to the conclusion that it wasn't, that the details were just too gussied up for the literary magazine in which it was published. So that's the sort of thing that I like to study when it comes to the Revolutionary War. And in this presentation, it's going to be based on my book, The Road to Concord, which is about a little-known story of what happened before the fighting started. It's, as I say, the road to Concord, it comes all the way up to the Battle of Lexington and Concord, what everybody's expecting, and then I stop. And, but it's about the politics, the maneuverings, the secret missions, the espionage, and other things that were taking place in the several months before the Battle of Lexington and Concord. And for tonight, I'm going to be emphasizing the part that Stowe played in that event. I'm going to start this talk with something that James Warren wrote to his wife, Mercy Otis Warren, on April 6, 1775, which was 13 days before the Battle of Lexington and Concord. Warren was in Concord as delegate from the town of Plymouth to the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, which was the sort of extra legal or shadow legislature that the Patriots of Massachusetts had set up the previous October. The Provincial Congress by this point is basically the government of Massachusetts outside that little area in the circle, which was Boston. Governor Gage had troops in Boston. He had troops a few troops in Marshfield, on Castle Island in Boston Harbor, and up at Fort Pownall in Maine, where he had troops, he had control. Everywhere else, he could no longer maintain royal authority. James Warren was an important man in the Provincial Congress, which was pressing the resistance to General Gage, and part of that resistance was to set up a defense force, not just taking control of a militia company, but strengthening it, preparing it, equipping it for warfare, so it could stand up to the regular troops in Boston. And James Warren told Mercy on April 6th about one of the results of that effort. Quote, "All things wear a warlike appearance here. This town is full of cannon, ammunition, stores, etc., and the army long for them and want nothing but strength to induce an attempt at them. The people are ready and determined to defend the country inch by inch." So most histories of the Revolutionary War don't start out with Concord being, quote, full of cannon. In fact, many American authors have emphasized how poorly equipped and armed the Massachusetts Patriots were. Here's a typical description from the Siege of Boston, published by Alan French of Concord himself in 1911. "The Provincial Congress's Committee of Supplies gathered together a few hundred spades and pickaxes, some muskets, 1,000 wooden mess bowls, 4,000 flints, and a small supply of peas and flour, a pitiful attempt to compete with the vast resources of Great Britain." And that reflects how Americans like to look back on this conflict, thinking of ourselves as the underdogs, the poorly armed underdogs. James Warren's letter reflects how he and his fellow activists saw themselves in 1775 as determined defenders of their traditional rights, well-armed, well-trained, and equipped with cannon. So how did Concord come to be full of cannon? Where did those guns come from? Who paid for them? I'm going to explore those questions in the first half of this talk, and in the second half, I'll talk about what General Thomas Gage, the royal governor in Boston, what he decided to do about that. The journey to Concord began on September 1st, 1774. Early that morning, British soldiers on the orders of Royal Governor Gage, emptied this provincial powder house in what is now Somerville. General Gage also had his men take away 2 small cannon that belonged or were assigned to the Middlesex County Militia and were stored in Cambridge. The next day, 4,000 armed men marched into Cambridge. They forced the lieutenant governor and other royal appointees in town to resign. That day ended without violence, but it was truly revolutionary because by the end of the day it was clear to everyone that there was a new political order in Massachusetts. As I said before, General Gage's authority now stopped at the gates of Boston. He could control that little peninsula sticking into Boston Harbor, as the geography was then. As of September 2nd, 1774, the rest of Massachusetts was, for all intents and purposes, independent. Now, that was part of a political confrontation that had been going on for a decade since the Stamp Act. Gage now had to worry about defending the Boston Peninsula against attacks from the mainland. He had a contingent of the King's Army, including the Royal Artillery. On September 3rd, a Boston man named Thomas Newell wrote in his diary, 4 large field pieces were dragged from this common by the soldiery and placed at the only entrance of the town by land at Boston Neck, down here, where there's this narrow strip of land. So if you can guard that strip of land, you've guarded the town from invasion by land. However, to the people of Massachusetts, especially to the people down here in Roxbury, that looked like their own governor was now pointing cannon at them, which he was. So they began to collect cannon themselves. In fact, as early as September 2nd, that day of the uprising in Cambridge, towns were beginning to think about military preparation. There was a town meeting in Brookline that evening in which they decided to talk about whether they needed to bolster up their defenses. Also around Boston, there were cannon in shore batteries. The Charlestown battery, this is the Charlestown Peninsula, it contained 5 cannon, 18-pounders, meaning that they were built to fire cannonballs that weighed 18 pounds. That's how they designated cannons at the time. And in the first week of September 1774, people in Charlestown began to move the ammunition out of that battery. The governor heard about this. He sent over some officers on September 7th to investigate. And here's how the Boston merchant John Andrews described how people in Charlestown reacted to that officer's visit. The inhabitants, suspecting what would take place, provided a number of teams, such as carried ship timbers, and slung all the guns belonging in the battery and carried up country, together with a reposite of shot, etc. About midnight, another formidable expedition of soldiers was set on foot. The boats from all the men of war were manned with soldiers with orders to dismantle the fort and bring off all the ordnance, stores, etc. But I imagine their chagrin was as great as their disappointment. Ox teams had hauled all the Charlestown guns away, and they were reportedly hidden on the town's schoolhouse hill under what an 1845 historian termed stable dirt. People in other towns followed Charlestown's example. On September 2nd, Samuel Pierce of Dorchester, down here, recorded in his diary, the great gun was removed from Preston's Point at the mouth of the Neponset River. Some of those cannon from Charlestown and Dorchester ended up out here in Middlesex County. A week later, the action moved inside Boston itself. The town had 2 batteries at the north and south end of the central harbor, and in 1770, those fortifications contained 22 cannon in between them. The Royal Artillery, Gage's troops, were already using the South Battery, so the Patriots couldn't get into that. But the North Battery was still staffed by a local militia company, and that made the people, the guns were all pointed out at the harbor to guard against the French invasion. That made the people in the harbor, i.e. the Royal Navy, rather nervous. Also, there were 2 small gun houses. See, these are the batteries. There are 2 small gun houses, or armories, near the center of town. And this is the builder's sketch of one of them. They were about the size of a 2-car garage, I think. And each held 2 small cannon on carriages, which were used by the town's militia artillery company, which was called the Train. Boston was very proud of its train and those 4 brass cannon that it used. Those were the only brass cannon, it appears, of any militia company in Massachusetts. The company displayed their skills on militia training days, basically doing war games on Boston Common, with half the company being the French and half the company being the heroic British. But there was also an even deeper split in the Boston train, because the man in charge of the company, a coachmaker named Adino Paddock, had been born in England, and he leaned toward the crown. But most of the officers and most of the men were Whigs or patriots. On September 5th, 1774, the Boston Militia Artillery Company was supposed to have a training day, but instead of drilling, it appears that the company just argued and fell apart, and Major Paddock had reaffirmed his loyalty to the crown, and the men refused to serve under him any longer. And there was no way that he was actually able to make them serve. General Gage didn't want Paddock to lose control of his company's 4 field pieces. So the merchant John Andrews reported, this is what the governor did next. Ever since the cannon were taken away from Charlestown, the governor has ordered a double guard to the new and old gun houses. So he was putting those little armories under army control. Then on the night of Wednesday, September 14th, things really started to move. Sailors from the Royal Navy entered the North Battery from the water and spiked all the guns inside. Spiking was a way to disable a gun, at least temporarily. In addition, the Boston Post-Boy newspaper reported that the cannon in the batteries back of Governor's Island in Boston Harbor were removed by the general's order. So together, those actions kept the shipping channel safe for the Royal Navy ships. There would be no chance of the locals using those cannon to fire out the king's ships. But in the morning, General Gage discovered that his troops weren't the only men busy that night. There was also an opening in the side of the train's older gun house, and the 2 brass cannons stored inside that little building were gone. Naturally, General Gage put an even stronger guard in front of the new gun house. Now, that site already seemed very secure. It was right beside Boston Common, and on Boston Common, the King's own 4th Regiment of foot was camped. At least 1 regiment, perhaps more. The gun house also seemed very secure. The door from the street was both guarded by redcoat soldiers now and locked, and Major Adino Paddock, a loyalist, had the only key. There was another wider door around on the right side, but it was barred on the inside. Even to get to that side door meant going through a gate in view of the camp, or around over a high fence around the yard, or through the South Writing School, which was a public school that shared the yard that was next door. And that school was in session nearly the whole day. So it was very difficult to approach this building. There seemed to be no way to get to the 2 brass cannon. They were both 3-pounders, so not very large, but nevertheless hundreds of pounds each, inside that gun house. Even that situation didn't seem secure enough to General Gage, however, so on Friday, September 16th, he ordered Royal Artillery officers to go to Major Paddock and get the gun house key, take the guns out from that little building, and move them into the camp under the control of the Royal Artillery. So an officer brought a number of artillery privates to remove those cannon, and when they opened the gun house, the guns were gone. All 4 of the Boston cannon had now disappeared. Now, there were still more cannon in Boston in September 1774 in hardware stores. And sea captains and merchants also sometimes owned cannon because they needed to arm their ships whenever there was a naval war with the French or the Spanish. Patriots began to quietly buy and take what cannon they could get out. On September 20th, a ship carrying iron cannon out of Boston ran aground on the Mill Dam, which is right here. And the Royal Navy seized those guns out of the little boat. At the end of the month, there was a big confrontation over the inventory of a hardware merchant named Joseph Scott. The Royal Artillery ended up carting away all his ordnance without his consent, and he went into hiding from the mob. That night, Dr. Joseph Warren, chairman of Boston's Committee of Correspondence, because Samuel Adams, who was usually the chairman, was in Philadelphia at the Continental Congress. He went to General Gage to complain. The doctor asked, "What is the meaning that the general buys military stores? Why does the army want even more weapons?" And Gage reportedly replied, "The country people were all armed and collecting cannon and military stores from all quarters, which could indicate nothing but their intention of attacking His Majesty's forces in that town. It is notorious that many cannon have been conveyed from thence, and arms carried out openly by every man that goes out of Boston." And in fact, in September 1774, it was a very busy start to what I call an arms race in Boston. This calendar lists all the major military events, developments in and around the town. The blue stars indicate where there was a provincial resistance gained control of cannon, and the red stars indicate when the Royal Military did. So there were just moves back and forth on this chessboard the whole month. General Gage tried to alert his superiors in London about this dangerous situation. On September 12th, he wrote to the Secretary of State for North America, Lord Dartmouth, "The country people are exercising in arms in this province, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, and getting magazines of arms and ammunition in the country, and such artillery as they can procure, good and bad." On September 25th, the general wrote to his other boss, the Secretary of War, Viscount Barrington, "The New England provinces, except part of New Hampshire, are, I may say, in arms, and the question is not now whether you shall quell disturbances in Boston, but whether those provinces shall be conquered. From appearances, no people are more determined for a civil war, the whole country from hence to New York armed, training, and providing military stores." But one thing General Gage did not tell his superiors in London about was that the Bostonians had managed to sneak 4 brass cannon out from under his own guards' noses. Maybe General Gage told himself those 4 cannon, they were pretty small, they were 2-pounders, 3-pounders, they weren't really a threat. But I think that disappearance was simply an embarrassment and a big threat to his standing, and so he just kept it quiet until he could solve this problem. In early October, the elected Massachusetts Provincial Congress convened to fill a political vacuum outside Boston. They first met in Salem, and then they adjourned to Concord, which was well beyond General Gage's easy reach. On October 25th, a committee of the Congress drew up a military budget that called for 20 field pieces, 20 cannon, 4 mortars, carriages, and other artillery supplies. So they were getting ready to go to war. Now, if you have a budget, you need somebody to manage that budget. And for that job, the Congress chose Henry Gardner of Stowe. He was 42 years old, son of the town's longtime minister. He had been elected to represent Stowe in the General Court and the Provincial Congress. The Congress named Gardner to be its receiver general, which is a sort of shadow treasurer for this shadow government. And it asked all the towns of Massachusetts to send their tax collections to him rather than to the royal treasurer in Boston, Harrison Gray. The Provincial Congress also formed a committee of safety and a committee of supplies. Meeting at Charlestown on November 15th, 1774, these combined committees voted unanimously to get 7 large pieces of cannon on the best terms and to get them out of Boston to someplace in the country. So this was part of a general movement of cannon away from the ocean side, the port towns, and into the countryside, where they could be re-equipped, put on different carriages, new equipment, gunpowder, and be put into use against the Royal Army. Again, this was about 2 months after the people themselves began to grab those cannon in Charlestown, in Boston, and so on. The Committee of Supplies and Committee of Safety, the Provincial Congress was really catching up to what the people were already doing, and they were trying to take control and organize this process. That was towards the end of 1774. Meanwhile, what I call the arms race was moving outside of Massachusetts. In December 1774, on December 8th, the Rhode Island Assembly voted to remove all the guns from Fort George off Newport and move them up to Providence. And the royal governor of Rhode Island very frankly told a captain of the Royal Navy that the Patriots had stripped the Newport fort of the guns to prevent them from falling into the hands of the king. So in Rhode Island, at least according to this Royal Navy captain, they weren't hiding behind euphemisms. They were now getting ready for rebellion. 5 days later, the people of New London, Connecticut moved their cannon into the country. People began to wonder about New Hampshire, where Fort William and Mary guarded Portsmouth Harbor with cannon. Bostonians saw signs that the Royal Navy was about to send a ship up to Portsmouth to take over that fort. So the next day, Paul Revere rode 60 miles on icy roads on a little cart, not on horseback, to warn the New Hampshire patriots. Militiamen stormed Fort William and Mary, overwhelming the captain and 6 soldiers inside, and they seized most of the gunpowder in the storehouse. 2 days later, New Hampshire's 2 delegates to the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia. They came over, looked at the situation, and they led militia units back into the fort to take out the cannon and the rest of the ammunition. So this was the top rank of New Hampshire patriots getting involved in removing cannon. The captain in charge of the ship, of the fort, who was a Royal Army captain, he reported shooting 3 4-pounders at the militiamen. So he actually shot his own cannon at the locals. But nobody was killed or hurt. If there had been any deaths, we would probably be talking about the shot heard around the world not happening in Lexington or Concord or anywhere in Massachusetts, but happening up in Portsmouth Harbor. And we would have to say that the aggressors in that fight were not the British regulars coming into town, but the patriots attacking a heavily outnumbered British outpost to seize weaponry. So that would be a very different story we'd have to tell about how the Revolutionary War began. By the end of 1774, it was clear to General Thomas Gage that the Crown had lost control not just of Massachusetts, but of all of New England. The other governors were either powerless or on the side of the patriots. And it was also clear to General Gage from the letters he was receiving from London that he was not going to get much help. He was largely on his own. To his credit, he didn't give up. He started an effort to infiltrate the Patriot movement in Massachusetts and to ferret out where they were hiding their cannon. On February 21st, 1775, the Committee of Safety and Supplies met in Charlestown. John Hancock was in charge. Dr. Joseph Warren had come out from Boston for that meeting, along with another high-level Boston Patriot organizer named Dr. Benjamin Church. And there were 8 other provincial Congress delegates from outside Boston. And they had decided that by this point, they had control of enough cannon that they could start organizing artillery companies out in the countryside. On that same February 21st, according to documents in his files, General Gage suddenly had a lot more information on the Patriots' weaponry. I mean, it was very detailed. In all, Gage soon wrote, there are in the country 38 field pieces and 19 companies of artillery. He knew exactly what towns the guns were being stored in and which blacksmiths were making the gun carriages to put the guns on. General Gage had made a deal for information with Dr. Church, that Boston Patriot. We don't have an authentic picture of him, so I'm showing a bit of a ciphered letter that he sent into Boston later in 1775. Thanks to Dr. Church, Gage knew where most of the provincial knew that most of the provincial Congress's guns were in Worcester. There were also a few at Watertown, some in Salem, including some pieces of brass cannon in Salem, and a few in Concord. So the general started to make plans. Back in early January, he had asked Army officers capable of taking sketches of a country to contact his office. And on February 22nd, the day after he got this information from Dr. Church, he wrote out information for 2 officers who had come forward, Captain William Brown of the 52nd Regiment and Ensign Henry de Bernier of the 10th Regiment. They were to hike out into Massachusetts in civilian clothing as far as Worcester County, taking notes on roads, towns, passes, fords, and other geographic features, because, Gage said, he expected to have occasion to march troops through the country the ensuing spring. The 2 officers left Boston on February 23rd with a servant, probably an enlisted man. By midday, they had gotten as far as Watertown, and there, while they were having their midday dinner in a tavern, a black woman told them that she recognized them both as officers of the Army. So their cover was completely blown. But they understood that it was absolutely necessary to push on to Worcester, where the Patriots were collecting the most supplies, so Brown and de Bernier continued west. Meanwhile, the Committee of Safety and Supplies had another long meeting, and General Gage soon received more information. And in particular, Dr. Church conveyed, there are 8 field pieces in an old store or barn near the landing place at Salem, where they are to be removed in a few days, the seizure of which would greatly disconcert their schemes. So Gage's previous message from Church had talked about brass cannon in Salem, and now he was being told exactly where the Salem guns were and that they would be moved shortly. So if he wanted those guns back, he had to move fast. He ordered an expedition to Salem. Late on Saturday, February 25th, Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Leslie and 240 men sailed from Castle William in Boston Harbor. Their ships docked at Marblehead. The soldiers reportedly stayed below decks until most of the townspeople had gone into their meeting houses and churches. Then the troops quickly disembarked, formed into their companies, and started to march towards Salem. Now, in fact, this man, a painter named David Mason, was working for the Committee of Safety in Salem. He had collected about 12.5 cannon from a local Patriot sea captain and the town and local fortifications, and he had a blacksmith named Robert Foster mounting those guns on carriages at a shop in the north of the town. Mason was attending church services when he heard that there were redcoats coming through, or coming closer. Somebody ran into the church with the news, so he raced out of the meeting house to Foster's shop. To get to the shop required crossing a drawbridge over Salem's North River. So Mason and his friends started to move the cannon out of Foster's shop, and they also pulled up that drawbridge. When Lieutenant Colonel Leslie and his men arrived, guided by local loyalists, they could see the smithy they were supposed to reach, but they couldn't get across the water. There was a stalemate. Leslie yelled for the men on the other side to let the bridge down. Here in this 19th century painting, this is the bridge. Mason and Foster refused. Some soldiers moved toward 2 gondolas in the riverbank, thinking they could get across on the boats. Locals jumped into those boats and started to scuttle them by cracking the holes in the bottom with hatchets. That scuffling even drew a tiny bit of blood, which is why Salem, some people still say, that was the first blood of the Revolutionary War. Other riders had gone out to other towns in Essex County, alerting the militia. And after nearly 90 minutes with the sun going down, the Reverend Thomas Bernard, minister of the nearby meeting house, negotiated a compromise. Mason, who by this point knew that all of the cannon had been removed, agreed to let down the bridge. Leslie pledged his honor that he would not march 30 rods beyond it, that he would follow his orders to the letter to go to this smithy, search it, and then leave. The men of the 64th Regiment stepped across the channel, as agreed, turned around, and marched back to their ship in Marblehead. The militia companies from other towns watched from nearby hillsides, watched from a distance. Again, a single gunshot could have started the Revolutionary War there. February 26, 1775. That would have happened in the middle of the largest settlement, Salem and Marblehead, in Massachusetts, outside of Boston, in the middle of a crowded semi-urban community. But it didn't happen. No one died. And so, once again, there was still no war. In his report to Lord Dartmouth, General Gage acknowledged some embarrassment about how the Salem expedition had worked out. The circumstances of the 8 field pieces in Salem led us into a mistake for supposing them to be brass guns brought in from Holland or some of the foreign islands, which report had given reason to suspect. And in fact, there's nothing in Gage's intelligence papers to indicate he had received any hint of these guns being smuggled from Dutch islands or Holland. But saying that he was going after smuggled guns wouldn't raise questions in London. Saying he was trying to retrieve brass cannon that had been stolen from Boston would have raised questions. In the end, Gage insisted to Lord Dartmouth the Patriots had secured only some old ship guns which had been carried away from Salem some time ago. On March 3rd, a week later, the local Essex Gazette newspaper told a different story. 27 pieces of cannon were removed out of this town in order to be out of the way of robbers. And meanwhile, remember Captain Brown and Ensign de Bernier, they were still out trying to carry out their orders in Worcester. They were taking notes on the cannon that they had seen in that town and drawing maps of the road out. They couldn't travel on Sunday, so they were sticking to their tavern, doing all this work. But that evening, and this was after the stalemate in Salem had started, so people may have gotten the news, two men came to the tavern where the officers were staying and told the landlord that they knew those strangers were officers of the army. So they left the next morning. They stumbled across a militia drill in Framingham. They headed to Marlborough. A loyalist named Henry Barnes let the officers into his house, but told them that they were very well known by the townspeople. In fact, a party of Liberty people had been looking for them the night before. And a few years before, Barnes's neighbors in Marlborough had warned him against cooperating with the royal authorities by tarring and feathering his horse. So he had reason to be nervous. And after only 20 minutes, Barnes asked the officers to leave. And then they trudged east through a snowstorm and eventually made it back to Boston. Around this time, General Gage developed another intelligence source out in the Massachusetts countryside. That source's letters to Gage indicate that he or she lived in Concord. I'm still trying to figure out who this person is. I don't know. The main clue is that he or she wrote to Gage in terrible French as a way to disguise the messages from anybody who might happen to, or for most people who might happen to look at it on the way. As of March 8th, that spy sent a message to General Gage from Concord saying, 4 brass cannon and 2 cohorns or mortars, so called by the peasantry, concealed at Mr. B, lately chose or appointed minute colonel, supposed to be deposited in his cellar. Those 4 brass cannon were the guns from Boston. The Patriots had smuggled them out of town around the turn of the year, hidden them for a while at a tavern in Dorchester, and then moved them out to Concord. In addition, Gage's spies said 2 pieces of iron ordnance, supposed to be 4 or 6 pounders, are mounted on carriages said to be very indifferent, in the courthouse and watched at night, hitherto by a slender guard of Minutemen. Those guns had been moved out from Watertown, which back in October had voted to mount 2 pieces of cannon now lodged in this town. The word lodged suggests that these artillery pieces were new arrivals, not owned by anyone local, perhaps removed from the batteries around Boston. So more and more guns were being moved out to Concord. And in fact, the spy finally wrote, 8 more pieces of iron ordnance were this day, le 8 du mois de mars, the 8th of March, conveyed to C, Concord, from L, maybe Leicester, maybe another town, where they were had been deposited a few days preceding their last removal. 2 of the 8 appeared smaller than the rest, and about 3 or 4 pounders. These last mentioned were met at a small distance from Concord in 3 carts. There were no appurtenances, but it was said that the carriages were made and making at Salem and soon to follow. So these seem to have been some of those guns that David Mason had been looking after in Salem, again being moved out to Concord. The spy said that the brass cannon were concealed at Mr. B, lately chose or appointed minute colonel. Well, Concord's new colonel, in charge of the new Minutemen and the new cannon, was James Barrett, a 65-year-old farmer and representative at the Provincial Congress. And this is his house. Barrett himself kept an inventory of the military stores he was collecting in Concord, which is now at the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester. And his inventory exactly matches what the spy said was out there. Barrett wrote down 4 brass cannon, 10 iron cannon, 2 mortars. Barrett also wrote down which of his neighbors were storing either more supplies for him in the military and the Committee of Safety, musket cartridges, musket balls, flints, gunpowder, entrenching tools, medical chests, tents, tent poles, dishes, spoons, and 4 barrels of oatmeal containing 20 bushels. So he was really starting to supply an army. Likewise, the spy reported to Gage on which Concord families were storing gunpowder, small arms, flour, and other food. And again, these 2 pieces of information match up. Everybody in Concord knew this. On March 11th, the same spy reported on a trip to Worcester and what artillery he or she had seen there, but that report ended The brass cannon, which formerly were in the hands of Mr. Paddock, veritably are now at Concord. So this spy knew that General Gage wanted information on the brass cannon from Boston. After hearing about that, the governor ordered Brown and de Bernier back out into the countryside. They hiked out to Concord in disguise on March 20th to poke around for hidden weapons. Between their own observations and the reports of loyalists, the officers confirmed that the town had 14 pieces of cannon, 10 iron and 4 brass, and 2 cohorns. Their iron cannon they kept in a house in town. Their brass they had concealed in some place behind the town in a wood. And they also had to bring back their host, the loyalist Daniel Bliss, because his neighbors had warned him they would not let him go out of town alive for helping the governor. In March, General Gage sent another letter to Lord Dartmouth, the Secretary of State, suggesting that he received a letter from Lord Dartmouth, and the Secretary of State suggested that he, quote, recover into the king's possession those cannon and stores which have been taken away in so extraordinary a matter from the fort at Newport. So the general is having enough trouble just keeping track of cannon that had been in Massachusetts, and now London was saying, oh, you should go help Rhode Island as well. This was not helpful at all. Meanwhile, the Provincial Congress was having trouble of its own. Many towns had simply sat on the money they collected in taxes rather than sending it to either the royal treasurer or to Henry Gardner, the receiver general. So during the same session of the Congress in Concord, when James Warren boasted, "This town is full of cannon," the Congress had to send out this broadside asking towns to send tax money to pay for those cannon and to pay for all the other military preparations they were doing. However, the fact that the Congress was willing to do this so publicly with a printed sheet and with the names of John Hancock and Benjamin Lincoln signed to it show how strong and confident they felt. They were acting like the legitimate government. On April 14th, General Gage received new orders from London, written January 27th. Lord Dartmouth now did not merely authorize or suggest military action against the rebellion, he told the general that he had to act. The ministry specified that the first and essential step would be to arrest the principal actors and abettors in the Provincial Congress, even if such a proceeding should be, according to your own idea of it, a signal for hostilities. So arrest the rebel leaders even if it brings on war. But Gage didn't arrest anyone. He wasn't tracking John Hancock or Samuel Adams or any of the members of the Committee of Safety. General Gage's intelligence files and his orders show that he was focused entirely on Concord and on the weapons out there. The Massachusetts Provincial Congress was meeting there in April. And of course, those cannon and the brass guns were hidden there. In mid-April, both the Concord spy and Dr. Church were in Concord sending details about the town's military preparations, or the colony's military preparations. The Concord spy again confirmed that Barrett's house was where the brass cannon are still hidden. Seizing those field pieces at Barrett's farm would require a march deep into hostile territory, 17 miles to Concord and another 2 across the North Bridge. Each of those miles meant that the troops would be more tired. Each quarter hour they spent searching would leave them more exposed. But if the mission succeeded, it would erase the embarrassment of having let those 4 brass cannon get away in the first place. That's what I think that was one of the main motivations for General Gage to order this very risky mission. And when he wrote out his first draft of orders for Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith, the top item he wanted the soldiers to look for were 4 brass cannon and 2 mortars or cohorns in the cellar or outhouses of Mr. Barrett a little the other side of the bridge. However, already James Barrett and his family had started to move the most important military supplies to neighboring towns and to hide the rest. Colonel Barrett's grandson James, who was then 14 years old, remembered how, with oxen and cart, he and other boys removed the stores deposited at the house of his grandfather into the woods and concealed them, a cartload at a time, under pine boughs. And to speed the movement, the grandson said in 1848, the lads would march on each side of the oxen and goad them into a trot to get them moving as fast as they could. Concord traditions say that the Barretts plowed a field, laid muskets into the furrows, and then plowed dirt over them. Women reportedly camouflaged barrels of musket balls up in the attic with feathers. The most specific local tradition about where they put the artillery, published in 1835, says that Barrett's helpers took 4 cannon to Stowe, where they were hidden in the woods north of the lower village, not far from the residence of Henry Gardner. And those were most likely the most valuable cannon, the 4 brass cannon from Boston. And it makes sense for Gardner to have been sent them because he was already looking after the Massachusetts Provincial Congress's money. He was already trusted as somebody who would keep things safe. Sometime on April 18th, while he was in the last stages of planning for the march to Concord, Gage received news that the military stores are removed. The field pieces are committed to the care of several towns in the county. Only 4 field pieces were still in town, now in Concord Townhouse. Now, I suspect those 4 were left because they belonged to Concord itself, the town, not to the Provincial Congress. But Gage didn't know which 4 cannon were still in Concord. Could those 4 be the 4 brass cannon from Concord? Was it worthwhile? Well, he still went ahead with his march. He revised his instructions for Lieutenant Colonel Smith to be less specific. He still hoped that the troops would find artillery, and he said, "If you should meet with any brass artillery, you will order their muzzles to be beat in to render them useless." But he could no longer give Lieutenant Colonel Smith such a detailed listing of where all the supplies were in Concord because they had been moved out. He still hoped, nevertheless, that the troops would find those 4 brass guns. He also took a lesson from the Salem expedition by trying to stop the Patriots from sending alarm messengers ahead of the troops. He sent out mounted officers on the night of April 18th to patrol the roads between Cambridge and Concord and stop any messengers from getting through. But ironically, the sight of British officers riding into town alerted many locals that something was up. In Lexington, a small militiamen saw those officers and they started to gather because they were afraid that there was now going to be an attempt to arrest Hancock and Adams or to go after the military supplies. After sunset on April 18th, 1775, about 800 British soldiers were rowed quietly out of Boston on their way to Concord. That was more than twice as many as went to Charlestown in September 1774 or went up to Salem in February 1775. There was quite a strong force, but it was already too late to catch Massachusetts' cannon. And on the road to Concord, those British soldiers would come upon the Lexington Militia Company lined up on the common, and there would be shooting, and for the first time, those shots would be fatal, and that's why we say the war began on April 19th. And that's why I say that 4 stolen cannon were what really ignited the Revolutionary War. Thank you. Now, of those 4 cannon, 2 of them actually survived the war and were sent back to Massachusetts by the new national government in the 1780s. Henry Knox, the Secretary of War, had them engraved with the names of Hancock and Adams and a little exaggerated history of their importance. So once they were engraved, they were very easy to identify and distinguish from any other cannon, and it's easy to track them after that. The Hancock is now on display at the Concord Visitor Center of Minuteman National Historical Park, and the Adams was mounted for many years in the chamber at the top of the Bunker Hill Monument. But last year, it was the National Park Service finished conserving it and reinstalled it in a display case in the lodge at the bottom of the monument, so it is much easier to see now because you don't have to climb all those steps. As for Henry Gardner, he segued from being the Provincial Congress's Receiver General to being the first Treasurer of the independent state of Massachusetts. This is one of the bills. It was a request from a company of Massachusetts soldiers in December 1775 asking him to please give their pay to their captain so that he could distribute it to them. And it's signed by all the soldiers. Gardner died in 1782 in his early 50s before the Revolutionary War officially ended. I don't believe there's a portrait of him. His house was torn down in 1875, so his monument is really the paperwork that he created, that he looked after for the people of Massachusetts as it was becoming on its transition from a colony to an independent state. So I'd be happy to answer questions about what I've talked about here. And I also have copies of The Road to Concord and other books in case I have intrigued you and you want to read in great detail more about this, this project. Yes, sir?
I'm curious, when these cannons were forged.
Were forged, yes.
Didn't they have hallmarks on them or foundry marks on them?
Did the cannon have hallmarks or foundry marks? Not really. The way we identified the cannon, I was instrumental in identifying these cannon and making them more visible within the Park Service. The identifying mark from the newspaper account in 1768 of these two cannon being delivered from London said that they had the province arms on them, the state seal of Massachusetts. And indeed, they still do have the seal of Massachusetts from that time on them. But the other markings are not easily distinguishable.
And they're not serialized, right?
No, and it's also the Continental Army did a very poor job of actually keeping track of what guns were going where. We have like inventories of all the cannon that were available at the Siege of Boston to General Washington's army as of October 1775, but it does not. This paperwork does not say where those cannon were deployed. Again, we have General Knox's, or Colonel Knox's at the time, his list of all the cannon that he had brought was bringing from Fort Ticonderoga and Crown Point on Lake Champlain, but we don't have exactly where he deployed them along the siege lines in February and March 1776. Yes, sir?
A couple things. First one is, do we know exactly where in Stowe those two cannons were stored?
The best information I could find, which is from 1835, says that they were, gives that description of, what was it? The lower village, what did I say? Hidden in the woods north of the lower village, not far from the residence of Henry Gardner. And Henry Gardner, I understand that his house was later the Gardner Inn, and I don't know this town well enough to know where that was, but there is, I can see from the town website and local histories, there is still a tradition that there were armaments stored here. I just don't know whether whether that tradition is right here or in this general vicinity.
Is there confirmed evidence that the other two cannons were destroyed?
The other two cannon, we know as of May 1775 that these cannon were believed by the British Army to be in Cambridge. At the end of the Siege of Boston in April 1776, Boston had a town meeting and they sent a pretty high-level committee, including Paul Revere and Thomas Crafts, to General Washington to ask for those cannon back. I don't know if they ever got to General Washington because he was already about to leave. And if they had gotten to him, they would probably said, "Gentlemen, I have a war to win. I need all the guns I can get." When the two cannon that survived were sent back in the 1780s, the Boston newspapers hailed this event very proud, talked about how they were going to be engraved, and said it was very interesting. They had been captured in the war, and the other two were lost, but these had been captured and back, and we'll tell you all about it in our next issue. And I haven't found any other word in any newspaper. So I'm very frustrated about that. But it looks like the other two, which were probably 2.5 pounders, were captured at some point during the war and never came back. Yes, ma'am.
Were you involved in any way or any knowledge of the cannon that was found on the Barrett property as of a few years back?
Was I aware of any cannon found on the Barrett property? Are you thinking of the History Detectives TV show, or are you thinking of something else?
I was at the visitor center with a niece who grew up in this area.
Yeah.
When she was 18, said, "I'm going to visit it, let's go check it out." and they were showing the video of it.
Okay, yes, that is, I believe that video comes from the PBS TV show History Detectives. And if you watch the credits at the very end and slow it way down and look at the little letters, you'll see me listed as a consulting person on that episode. And that is the Hancock cannon that it was talking about. At that time, it was also put in the top of the Bunker Hill Monument for a while. And then in the 1970s, it was removed for safety. It was moved to an MDC place, and so on.
Same thing, because supposedly this was dug up on that property as of a few years back.
Okay, then
And what was in Bunker Hill years back.
no, that's right. It could not have been. My understanding is the only video that they've shown at the Concord Visitor Center is based on History Detectives. And it was based on talking with a descendant of the Barrett family who had heard this tradition in her family of these cannon being stored at her great-great-great-great-grandfather's farm. And indeed, as I said before, there is this tradition of when the British were about to come out in mid-April 1775, the family burying guns on the farm, moving guns out. So that might be where the idea that this had once been buried on the farm. But I am not aware of any gun being dug up in Concord in the past 20 years or so. There is a case of a cannon being found in Groton about 25 years ago, which had obviously been put on display as some sort of monument, but there's no record of why it would be displayed. And it is clearly a George III era gun, and nobody has any idea what it's doing there. And the local man who found it and has produced a very fine carriage, period type carriage to display it on, he has this theory that it's involved in this story, and it's not. It just doesn't make sense. But it's definitely a George III cannon, so good for him. I don't know where it got from. Yes, sir.
You had mentioned these are the most important cannons. They sound like they're smaller than other cannons do. Is it just a pride thing, or what was the importance?
The importance, well, one thing, they were brass, and brass cannon were pound for pound stronger, so a brass 3-pounder was lighter than an iron 3-pounder, and therefore easier to move around and maneuver. Secondly, brass, if it bursts, it doesn't explode into pieces like an iron cannon does, and therefore doesn't take out your whole gun crew. So for those reasons, brass cannon were seen as more important. And yes, there was a great deal of pride for Boston, and I think there was a certain amount of pride or embarrassment for General Gage, because he clearly was more interested in tracking those brass cannon than practically anything else he was working on.
So the picture you showed of the Adams cannon,
Yeah,
was that the failure you're...
That hole, nothing gets by you folks. There was a big hole in there. In the early 1820s, there was a different idea of preservation back then. And the Massachusetts government actually lent out these two guns to the Ancient and Honorable Artillery Company of Boston when they wanted to practice gunnery in the 1820s as a private militia group. And they practiced, and boom, one of those guns, and they were now over 50 years old, burst and created this big hole. And so that's why there is a big hole in the Adams cannon. Even then, the Massachusetts the period's idea of preservation when they got back this cannon was not, oh, we should take better care of this now. They thought, we should melt this down and recreate it. And they probably just didn't have the money to do that. So as a result, we actually have a true historic artifact. But you can see from the way that hole burst and just left a hole about that big, that it did not, the whole thing did not blow up, and no ancient and honorables were harmed in the practice.
Something that could be repaired, or is that just a total loss, need to be melted down?
They would not have been able to repair that at the time. They would have either melted that down, or in this case, decided it was important enough to keep around for another 20 years and then put up in the Bunker Hill Monument.
Not to get you off track, but I remember from the book, the idea that they got the cannon out, they actually got it from the school, did they not?
Yes. In this talk, I cleverly hid how they actually got the cannon out of the gun house. But yes, so go ahead. Yeah. It was crucial to, I mentioned that that gun house shared a yard with the South Writing School, where 200 boys showed up 6 days a week to practice their handwriting and arithmetic. At some point during the process, the cannon were stored, hidden inside that school, probably for about 2 weeks, and not one boy whispered the news. And there were also girls coming in there during the dinner break for their lessons. Not one girl told anybody. That was kept completely secret, and the royal authorities and the loyalists never discovered where those guns were.
This school is not the basis of the Boston Latin School, is it?
No, in the 17th and 18th century, Boston had two types of town schools. The grammar schools, which were to prepare boys for Harvard and supposedly careers as ministers, although 2/3 of them went into other professions, and that was a curriculum entirely of Latin and Greek. And then there were the writing schools where you learned how to do very lovely handwriting in the 18th century style and business math. And those schools were training boys to become merchants. And so there's a real class distinction between those schools. And so the writing school boys and the Latin school boys were at odds. And they used to have rumbles in the streets and things like that. So no, the writing school boys would not have wanted to be confused with the Latin school boys and vice versa. In 1789, there was a school reform, and everything was reorganized. The Latin school curriculum was made a little more inclusive. Reading was added to the curriculum, and for the first time, girls were allowed to study in the Boston town schools for only 6 months of the year. But we could think that maybe the girls only needed 6 months to learn the whole thing.
At school, the kids would be, speculating, but the kids would have been actually very loyal to the cause because their parents, being merchants, had a lot to lose.
They could have been, although it's likely, given that there were 200 boys in there, that some of their parents were loyalists. But we do know that, for instance, the teacher of the school, he had only one assistant, a 14-year-old who had graduated a couple of years before. That 14-year-old went on to become a Continental Army officer. So at least as far as we can tell, I mean, that's the only boy I've been able to identify in that school, that they leaned patriot. I think there's a great deal of feeling of unity among the boys of Boston at the time, and very few are actually being active as loyalists, even from loyal families. Yes, sir.
So were these four cannon were the only brass cannon in New England at the time?
They were the only brass cannon in Massachusetts. Rhode Island, when Rhode Island sent artillerists up to the siege in the spring of 1775, they came with 6-pounder brass cannon, and so they were the elite artillery for a while. But brass cannon were rare for militia units. They were more common in the Royal Artillery.
So that report that had sent Gage to Salem of there being brass cannon in Salem, you're saying that was incorrect?
I think that was incorrect. There is, in fact, a statement from Dr. James Thatcher, who was a military surgeon during the war and published his diary afterwards, saying that stating quite specifically that there were only 4 brass cannon and a whole bunch of what he called honeycombed iron cannon, which is like old, worn-out iron.
Yes, sir.
So the 4 brass cannon that's stored in Stowe. So
I think.
okay. So do we know when they were sort of taken out from hiding and reused?
What happened afterwards? The next account I've seen of them specifically is a British intelligence report in General Gage's files from May 1775 saying that they had been moved back toward the siege lines in Watertown and Cambridge. After that, nothing. And as I said, the American records are aren't very helpful on where specific guns go. I believe they probably were deployed in Dorchester because the militia at the time was arranged around counties. And Dorchester and Boston were part of the same county at the time, Suffolk County. In the Provincial Congress's records, it shows that they were sort of reassuring this man in Dorchester named Lemuel Robinson that if those cannon were not available to be used by men from Boston, he could have them. Lemuel Robinson was in fact the tavern keeper who had stored those cannon in February of 1775, January and February. So he already had them, and he had them under a manure pile, and he seems to have been not an easy man to work with. So probably he said, I should have these, I should have these. So my bet is that they were sent back to Dorchester, not necessarily for his regiment, but so that they would still be in part of Suffolk County. And therefore they were probably deployed in the part of the colony where that little land neck of Boston met the mainland to try to keep the British army from coming down the neck. And there was hardly ever any fighting there because both sides were so well fortified that there were just little raids. There was no equivalent to the Battle of Bunker Hill there.
But you also said, Watertown and somewhere else?
Watertown and Cambridge would have been the closest they got, and once they got to Cambridge, then there would have been the distinction of whether you go over the bridge across the Charles down to Roxbury and Dorchester, or you go across to East Cambridge and Charlestown. And so I think that at that point, if they were in fact sent back to Lemuel Robinson's regiment or his town, that's where the decision point would have been.
You mentioned about the militias having cannon. Was that common?
It was not.
Militias or
How did militia have cannon? That was not common. It looks like there was an initiative in the early 1770s by the royal governor at the time, Thomas Hutchinson, to encourage counties to create militia artillery companies. Boston already had theirs, started in the mid-1760s under Major Paddock, and that was very well respected, and so it was supposed to be the model for these others. Middlesex County had one. Lemuel Robinson was captain of one out in the other part of Suffolk County, and there may have been others in, say, Plymouth County or Essex County. But there really weren't, it was rare, it was new, partly because these guns were so expensive. And unlike muskets, which a farmer might be able to use for fowling or hunting or things like that, there was really no use. If you had a cannon out here in Stowe, what would you use it for?
But you mentioned that, were you saying hardware merchants?
Hardware merchant, yes.
Where else would the sources of them be?
Hardware merchants and ship's captains and merchants who were trading on the ocean, they would need cannon because if at any moment the British Empire were once again to go to war against the French or the Spanish, you needed to have your ships armed in case the opposing empire's navy or privateers attempted to capture your ship. So if you had a few cannon, you could ward off attackers. And then when the wars ended, suddenly you were left with this hardware. There was a man in Boston named Thomas Handison Peck who was a hatter, and he had a cannon in his basement, according to a letter he wrote later in 1775. And it had just been there since the last war. He just obviously had no place else to put it, no other reason to have it. For some reason, he had never sold it or given it away or whatever. It was just in his basement. So but those cannon would all have been concentrated along the coast in the port towns as merchants loaded and unloaded their ships. And would have remained there or until this crisis in September 1774, when suddenly people like Captain Richard Darby of Salem and a merchant named William Molyneux in Boston, they began to move their cannon out to give them to the Provincial Congress or to sell them to the Provincial Congress to be used to resist the crown.
Do you have any estimate of how many cannon might have been floating around?
Well, I mean, after a great deal of trouble, after a great deal of effort, in February 1775, the Provincial Congress had collected 38. And Mr. Peck's was still in his basement, and those are the only ones I can think of. So it would be a matter of dozens, it would not be a matter of hundreds.
Okay, and there was a merchant in Salem named John Pedrick, I think.
Yes, John Pedrick. He had a daughter named Mehetabel Pedrick, who married a doctor who moved out from Boston named Dr. Elisha Story, and they had a number of children. And one of their children, in fact, became Justice Joseph Story, a very important Supreme Court Justice of the United States. Mehetabel Pedrick was known for telling these romantic stories about the Revolution. And one of them has talked about her father, John Pedrick, seeing the soldiers arrive in Marblehead on their way to Salem and getting on his horse and riding through the soldiers, taking advantage of his friendship with the officers until he got to the front of the car and said, good to see you, good to see you, and then rode off like hell to get to Salem and spread the warning. According to all the sources from 1775, John Pedrick was a loyalist. There are other stories Mehetabel Pedrick told, or Mehetabel Story told, including that her husband, Dr. Elisha Story, was one of the men who stole the cannon from Boston, and did so not by sneaking them out of the gun house, but by holding a British Army sentry in the camp on Boston Common at pistol point. I don't think anything Mehetabel Story told said is reliable. So John Pedrick, he does show up in a lot of history books as helping with that alarm in Salem, and I think that it's his daughter's legend only. Lunenburg is mentioned in the Provincial Congress records. It is possible that Pedrick was, the sources we know about him as a loyalist are newspaper reports saying that he had signed the complimentary address to General Gage, pressure from the newspapers, things like that. So he might have been feeling pressure to sell his salt. He may have even been coerced into doing so. There are other cases of merchants who are either being loyalist or trying to be neutral, whom crowds forced them to do so. So he might have, indeed, that might make sense. That
get some patriotic bona fides, is that what you're...
He might have been trying to get on the right side of the people who were in charge by that point. Okay. Certainly, he stayed in Salem and Marblehead. His family stayed. He never left. He never tried to go to Canada and so on. So like there were other people who ended up switching sides. In Weston, there's a historic site called the Golden Ball Tavern. That was a place where those two British spies, the officers, actually stayed overnight. And they had a great deal of help from the landlord, Isaac Jones, who told them that he was a loyalist and was very pleased to see them and offered help and where to go and things like that. Well, within 2 years, Isaac Jones was supplying food to the Continental Army. So he made his decision, and then he made his other decision as circumstances changed. Yes, exactly.
So do we know that when the cannons were brought to Stowe, were they already mounted on carriages?
Were they mounted on carriages? That is a good question. I do not believe they were.
So
because there were some mounted on carriages, but when the British Army got out to Barrett's farm, one of the few things they found were carriage wheels, and they burned those. So Barrett was still working on carriages, I think.
So when they left Stowe, did local Stowe blacksmiths potentially make carriages?
That is possible, but I think it's more likely, there are other mentions in the Provincial Congress of trying to get things mounted in Waltham, trying to get things, so I think that, I think there would be a record kept if they went to a blacksmith in Stowe. So I don't think so. I think that they would probably move closer to the siege lines, and then where lots of carriages could be built at once. But it's, again, still, it's very, very murky.
Just looking for a reason to do a Camden impression first.
The carriages were actually a real bottleneck for the Provincial Congress, because once these, the cannon existed, and some of them were damaged, so nobody really wanted them, you could get those, you could move those around, but you needed to have them on these strong carriages with maneuverable wheels, and then all the equipment that they needed, and those sometimes cost more than the guns themselves. And we can see in the Provincial Congress records and in where General Gage was spotting them, he was spotting them at places where they were waiting around to be mounted. So that's why I suspect that they were not on carriages. They had been thrown into the back of the ox cart by the Barretts and carried out here. As I say, I've actually held one of these cannon in my hands, and they are heavy. But you can, if you had 3 or 4 good strong guys, you could move them around and move them from a cart to a hiding place.
How much would a 9-pounder
Well,
weigh?
a 9-pounder would be heavier. These are 3-pounders and brass. A 9-pounder and made out of iron would probably be close to 1,000 pounds.
Well, would it have been within the capabilities of local blacksmith and wheelwrights to, make a carriage?
Yes, if you had a good wheelwright, and most towns did because you needed wagons, and if you had the plans, if you had the measurements or whatever, yes, you could do it with a carpenter, a wheelwright, a wagon maker, and a blacksmith. It required several people's skills, which is one reason why it was a difficult thing. And it looks like the blacksmiths were the people in charge of the process, because they kept finding, that's where the intelligence kept saying the blacksmiths, it was at this blacksmith shop or that blacksmith shop. But it would definitely have been possible for a country blacksmith with enough help and enough equipment, enough supplies to do this. Of course, he wanted to be paid. And that was the bottleneck. That was literally, there are records of the Provincial Congress having trouble paying these guys, and that news coming back to Gage through Dr. Church that the work had stopped. And that was where Henry Gardner came in, because if he had the money, this would probably have been one of his top priorities in terms of where to spend the money.
Why were the towns not entrusting him with the money?
Well, I mean, I'm sure you've been to a town meeting. I think they were hedging their bets. I mean, if you collected, I mean, already your town, the tax collections were already sort of slow anyway. But why would you give it all up right away unless you were really committed? And I think some of the towns were hedging their bets, wanting to make sure if say the whole imperial crisis blows over and there's a new government in London and they say, no, we'll cut back on these laws and we're terribly sorry. And well, why would you have risked not throwing your lot in with the rebels if it could work out better? I mean, it is really actually remarkable how many towns did commit to buying cannon for themselves. And since I've published this book, more and more people have come to me with additional information about towns like Lexington coming up with deciding to spend money on cannon. And as I say, once a town meeting decides to spend money, they are really committed to something. I don't know how many of the towns were not sending their money to Henry Gardner, but it was enough that the Provincial Congress felt the need to make a point.
Yes, sir.
Just to get off the subject a little bit, you mentioned regiment in Boston Common. What was the size of a regiment and then, you know, compared to a company or something?
A company would be about 70 people, and a regiment would be about 10 companies. And the Boston had its own regiment. Middlesex County had 3 or 4 regiments, and they were organized by county. So the militia was a very important institution in society at the time, because today when we think about an army, and, you know, a classic, you know, war movie, you've got, you know, your Southerner and your urban guy and your professor, and there's a melting pot. Back then, you went to war with your neighbors and your cousins and your brothers and people you had grown up with, and you chose your own officers and sergeants based on, you know, who gave the best parties during peacetime and who actually knew what they were doing in warfare during wartime. So it was a very different institution. The closest thing I can think of in today's society really is volunteer firefighting companies. So you would show up, you would do your drills with your neighbors and your friends and the guys you had grown up with 4 times a year. So you knew each other, and you trusted each other, or you knew who to not trust.
I think he was actually asking about the redcoats that were camped on the common.
Right.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry, yes. It's about the same. I mean, the American Army very much based itself on the British model. And the militia, I mean, up until the end of 1775, the American cause was still, this main argument was still, we are looking after our British liberties better than you are. We are British people who deserve all these rights and the respect of the crown, and it is only corrupt people in London who are trying to take this away from us. So they were still marching under the British flag often. They were modeling their army after the British, and it was not until 1776 when the idea of independency took hold. So it was about the same size.
My actual question was, so you said that by April 18th, not only had the cannon been moved from Concord, but the Gage already knew about it. And you've described a lot of cannon moving kind of hither and yon. Was the idea to keep them on the move, or does the fact that they were absent from Concord suggest that the people of Concord knew that the army was coming?
In April 18th, when they started to move in the mid-April, yes, they knew that the army was probably coming. The visit, when Paul Revere rode out on April 18th, he had actually been out to Concord a couple of times previously in the month with additional warnings. The news that came from London with these new orders for General Gage, that probably leaked because the Boston Patriots were getting out of town, except for Dr. Joseph Warren, and everybody was on high alert. So previous to that, the Massachusetts Provincial Congress was moving its cannon around to get them to places where they could be supplied and equipped, or to get them to the companies where they would be assigned. But starting in mid-April, they were hiding them. Okay, anything else? Or, well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to have a chance to talk. So, are you still with us? Oh, perfect, thank you. The Craig car and the Craig CR.
Between opposite and right.
Yeah.